Hey everyone, my name is Tabitha Burman. The JM webinar I chose was Perils of GMO Labeling. This webinar features guest speakers Nareej Arora, Sarah Mashri, Sabrina Roberts, Sydney Scott, and Maha Turi. Sorry if I butchered any of those names. But basically the essence of this webinar was the understanding if GMO labeling deters consumers from buying or purchasing a product. The research is interesting. It goes along the lines of what I would have thought the answer to be, but it definitely raises some good questions for policymakers and companies to understand if putting a GMO label on a bag helps consumers pick their product or not. I think one really good basis question to understand where we're starting off on is what is a GMO? Without getting too scientific, basically it just stands for genetically modified organism. If you want some more information, I have a link at the bottom of my slide that you can look up. It's basically from the Purdue website. And it goes into various things like what a GMO is, what's the purpose of it, whether it's good or bad, and just some products that have GMOs in it or is made from a GMO. But essentially, it's a crossbreeding of plants to create a crop or a food. Farmers use GMOs to deter insects and control weeds. GMOs help cut down the use of pesticides and weed control, which cuts the cost to create and stabilize crops. So it's definitely a good thing. It's not like it's adding more pesticides or more bad toxins to our food. I think it's funny if you look up the word GMO online, you'll see a lot of imagery of like people putting a needle in corn or like pumping things into Cheerios. It's interesting the concept of GMOs, but again, if you want some more information from that Purdue has a really good website that is cited in the slide itself at the bottom. So now that we understand what a GMO is, visualizing what a GMO is, you'll generally see the label on chips, or you might see it on like bread or cereal boxes. That's a good one. It's sometimes what I see is like a little butterfly and it will say like non-GMO product or certified approved non-GMO. But you'll see it around the grocery store next time. Potentially be on the lookout for it just so you can relate it to this presentation. But to jump in, we'll jump into the Pew Research that was presented during the webinar. So from here, there are two surveys essentially. The first one asks, is it safe to eat genetically modified foods? The average US adult, like you and I, 30%, 37% of us said it's okay to eat genetically modified foods. On the other side, scientists believe 88% of them believe it's safe to eat genetically modified foods. That's a huge gap, right? 37% of the average folk don't think it's safe to eat, or I should say believe it's safe to eat, where 88% of scientists say it's safe to eat. An interesting comparison that I found was the second question, which was climate change is mostly due to human activity. 87% of scientists believe climate change is due to human activity. In comparison, only 50% of US adults believe climate change is due to human activity. So I think they're funny comparisons. Basically, through this research, it seems the average US adult is more concerned with taking ownership of what is put in their bodies, like GMO, rather than taking ownership of like environmental impacts. As pointed out by one of the speakers, Sydney Scott, people find GMOs icky, which leads people to finding them not safe. I connect icky to a feeling, right? So I think a lot of the US adults are correlating the safety of GMOs to a feeling rather than fact. As we can, I think, again, see here, I'm maybe on the other side of the 50%. I don't know about the rest of you, but to me, climate change is due to human activity. So I think it's interesting that I should say I consider more on the scientist side of things, where I would agree with them more, versus GMOs. I think I was taught GMOs are bad, right? So I disagree with the science, and that's just a funny comparison between the two. That at one point I will agree and say, yes, the scientists are right here, and no, they're not right here. So this webinar definitely changed my ideas on a few things. But Sydney also stated that a lot of the US adults that were surveyed seem to think they know more than they actually do, or insinuated it that way, which I also thought was funny, because I think I was within that same boat as far as the GMO side. Um, Speaker Niraj Arora, who presented most, if not all, of the data, explains further that a panel of scientists who are Nobel Prize winners agree GMOs are not dangerous. Rather, they are helpful for cultivating crops, as we mentioned beforehand in that Purdue website, or that beforehand slide based by Purdue website. But they help cultivate crops. There has been no negative medical conditions correlated with GMOs. So that is to say they are safer than I think the average person believes. So how does GMO labeling impact consumers? So in the US, labeling is voluntarily. You won't see it on all items within a grocery store in the US like you would in Brazil. Countries like Brazil and the Netherlands state it's mandatory to have GMO labeling, as well as these other countries that you'll see on the map require labeling. So in Brazil, their GMO label is very eye-catching. It's essentially a yield sign with like a T in it, so it's hard to miss, especially on the food label. As research shows, the more prominent the label, the more it persuades the consumer from choosing non-GMO labeling. I think that's more based on how eye-catching, and I would almost say scary, because it looks like a yield sign. It makes you want to stop. I think that's what deters you more than potentially the education of what a GMO is. And I think a lot of the research presented enforces that. One example that the researcher used was pickles. They had all of these same pickle jars, and in stacks of 4, basically, the last one, all pickle jars had a label on it for either stating non-GMO or it had GMO. When the labels were added to the jars, adoption of those pickles dropped from 77% to 53%. So same jar, you just add a GMO label, people want it only 53% of the time rather than 77% of the time where it had no label. Another example that they used was chips. People deter from GMO chips and will pay more for non-GMO labels. I found this also interesting because I naturally just consider chips an unhealthy snack. So it's interesting that people would look at the labels for GMO more on chips, even though to me you could pick something better to snack on, honestly. It brings up a good point that one of the speakers brought up, Sarah Moshri. She's saying that the GMO label that is added to food could potentially dilute the other nutritional facts that consumers should be concerned about. Some examples I just thought of would be like sodium or vitamins, right? We might be more eye-catching to whether something has GMO or not, and it stops us from flipping over that packaging and seeing what other nutritions are on it. We just say, this doesn't have GMO, so it must be safe. I'm going to take it and I'm going to eat it, versus looking at what else, what other ingredients are a part of it. And I think chips correlates to that perfectly. Just thinking of it as an unhealthy snack naturally. It brings up the point of, are we asking the right questions, right? At the end of the webinar, Maha Tahini comes up and she speaks from a company's perspective. And she says companies are focusing too much on the GMO column. What companies may think is right is potentially the opposite of what the consumer wants, which is very different than what all the data showed, at least at the beginning of the webinar. Again, just makes you think, are companies asking the right questions? Is potentially Maha asking the right questions? She brought up an example of, she was in a boardroom, had various advertising or branding picked out. And the company said, this is the branding we want. This is the best branding that's going to be, where the consumers actually picked a different set of branding or different set of advertisements that would have connected with them more. It's hard because it just makes me think that potentially Maha might have skew data or may not be asking the right questions within her data sets. But it brings up another question of how can we educate the consumer? Are we asking the right questions and are we educating them properly? I don't necessarily know how you can educate consumers within your marketing. That's hard to say though, right? Because look at milk. Milk is believed to build strong bones, but we realistically don't need milk after a certain age. That might be a hot take, but marketing smarter might be where companies need to approach it to show them that GMOs don't actually have any negative health benefits, and finding a cool, fun, fresh way to do that versus just spewing facts. It definitely sets up just different marketing campaigns to bring education rather than persuading them, because it seems that's what the GMO labeling is doing now. It's persuading the consumer rather than actually having them make an informative decision based off educational facts. That's kind of the summary of this. I want to thank you guys for your time of watching this. The link for the webinar is also on the slide, as well as the webinar's name, American Marketing Association JW webinar, The Perils of GMO Labeling. I hope you guys have a good rest of your night.